Can you recall or do you know of a kinetic strike that seems to have occurred like the one that just recently did on people who they acclaim were purely drug smugglers in international water?
The only parallel I see was a DEA operation. I think it was 2012. And it was DEA in conjunction with local authorities. And I'm not sure if they had their hands on the triggers or not, or they're just kind of there as the operators, and the ones who are pulling the triggers were the local Hondurans. But they were chasing a boat in a river,
Mm-hmm.
and they shot at the boat, and several people in the boat died. It wasn't blasted over social media by the president at the time. And there
Yeah.
was a very long investigation that followed. And it also followed a series of new restrictions related to DEA operations in places like Honduras. So there have been instances in which this may have happened, or variations of this happened. And the repercussions, first of all, they were hidden, and second of all, the repercussions for the authorities involved were far and wide and deep. And so this is a completely different environment, if nothing else.
I saw I don't have a Truth Social account, so I saw somebody who had reposted on Twitter what Trump had posted. And I'm paraphrasing largely, but it essentially said if you were going to run drugs to the United States, pay attention to what just happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never seen anything like that in my
Me neither.
lifetime. I feel like we might have crossed a threshold here, and
Hmm.
I don't personally understand where the line is. And I'm curious. I mean, you are immensely more educated on this topic than me. I'm just, what are your thoughts when you first saw that? Assuming that these were just, in fact, drug traffickers. It is interesting they waited until they were in international waters to do this.
Hmm.
What do you think this means going forward? What's your take when you saw that headline?
I have a similar take that this is crossing a threshold. The threshold is in some ways legal, um,
Mm-hmm.
and I am not a legal scholar, so I'm not going to pretend to know if they did cross a line. I think the word terrorism and terrorist is doing a ton of work for them in that regard, and I think that they're leaning on that
Mm-hmm.
in many respects, irregardless of whether or not we think Tren de Agua was in the boat or are even terrorists. But that is what they're doing. They're using this kind of as camouflage for those actions. But it did cross a line of sorts. It reminded me of the attack, I think it was the Clinton administration affected against Al Qaeda after they bombed embassies, I think in Nairobi. But they
Mm-hmm.
bombed the embassy in Nairobi, if I remember correctly. This is like 1998. And then they had a missile strike against an encampment. That is the type of strike that this seems to be. This aiming at terrorist groups writ large while they do their criminal activities, regardless of whether or not they're aimed at the United States in this case. Because at first, the Secretary of State said that the boat may have been headed towards Trinidad and Tobago. And then he claimed the next day that it was going to the United States. So we don't, as you're pointing out, we don't have all the information. Doesn't appear that we're going to have information.
Mm-hmm.
And this appears to be literally the shot across the bow, not even across the bow, into the bow, to
Yeah.
say this is how we are now going to police the drug trafficking world. And then that's a pretty big statement.
How do you think? I mean, again, you are immersed in knowledge in this world that I don't have. I have a peripheral knowledge and an understanding to a fraction of a degree. How do you think that statement will be received by organizations like Tren de Aragua or others sitting on the side, cartels in Mexico, CJNC? What do you think maybe not necessarily their response, because from a tactical level they probably have a limited ability to do so, but internally, I mean, Maybe they're having their Thursday meeting right now, having a little roundtable discussion. I'm curious what you think their thoughts would be.
Well, I think we have to start with the fact that these are not top down, consolidated, vertically integrated structures. These are networks.
Hmm.
So these guys are, well, let's just leave aside for a second this whole question of Tren de Agua, which I have a huge problem with, by the way. I don't understand why they even leaned into the de Aragua designation in this case. I mean, if they were going to say it was a criminal group, they would have done a lot better saying it was the Cartel de los Soles. But we can talk about that in a minute.
Hmm.
Let's just leave that aside for a second. These criminal groups are networks. And so a lot of this stuff is outsourced. So if you're going to outsource things like transportation or renting of a boat um, or gasoline, I'm certain that this sort of activity, this action by the United States government would have some kind of reverberations, right, on
Hmm.
who would want to work in that space, right? If the risk level goes from 0 to 100, it's not 0, but if it goes from, very relatively low and you'll get picked up and tried and maybe you'll get thrown in jail in the worst case scenario, in most cases you probably won't get picked up, and then in many cases, even if you do get picked up, you'll get set free. So there's a lot of things in between dying in your boat and kind of nothing
Yeah.
happening, right? So there's this huge range. This now brings it to the sort of highest level, at least the possible highest level. So I think what they would be considering in their boardrooms of sorts is whether or not this is going to, first of all, where can this actually happen, right? Where can you see a military strike like this? As you pointed out, it was in international waters. I think
Yeah.
that's very important. They waited till it was international waters. It didn't do it in Venezuelan waters. That may be on the horizon, but right now it was international waters. Where else could this happen? Maybe on the U.S. border on land, maybe. Um, and then that is kind of about it. So how does that affect your business? Well, it affects you in terms of who you're going to be able to contract and whether you're going to be able to convince them to be continuing to be involved in this, and then where you're going to take the most care, right? And maybe you switch tactics. Maybe all of a sudden you don't use the go fast boats
Hmm.
as much. Um, maybe you take to the air, but maybe the air is also a place, if there is international airspace, where these sorts of things can happen. I don't know if we're seeing any mobilization of air power. But these are at the end of the day, these are super dispersed networks. So you're going to have a really hard time dismantling them with these targeted strikes. You may impede in some regard where they might be trafficking, who they might be able to contract. But the sort of the upshot is that because of the way these things are structured, you're really not going to be able to dismantle or really do any real damage to their ability to traffic drugs into the United States, Europe, or Asia, your three largest markets.
Yeah. How did you develop such an interest in these type of organizations, specifically in Latin America?
Well, I grew up in Chicago, and in Chicago there was always a general interest in these topics, and even in the town where I grew up, there was a history of sorts of mob um, presence. A very famous mobster, Sam Giancana, was killed in my hometown in 1975, which was my youth. I was too young to know what was going on back then, but it was kind of around us. My brothers played football with the grandsons of a guy named Tony Accardo, who was the largest mobster in Chicago at the time. And Tony Accardo used to go to the games with his bodyguards and things of that sort. So it was around me.
Hmm.
And then I sort of combined that general interest with what I studied. I studied history of Latin America, and a lot of that includes obviously drug trafficking, but also nefarious governments and military governments and other ways in which governments also cross over into the criminal world. So eventually they kind of combined. I think Venezuela, going back to that example, is a good one right now. If you look at the Venezuelan regime, in many ways, it's more or less a criminal state.
Hmm.
And so those sorts of ideas kind of melded, and I've always just been interested in the how and the why, and how all of that works. And so I just sort of have always leaned into that part of of my professional career.